My name is Donna McDowell, and I'm the Head of Schools and Family Learning here at St Paul's Cathedral. And it's my pleasure to give you a really warm welcome to the first GCSE conference that we've done here. And it is a very warm welcome, because it's very warm in here, isn't it? Sorry about that. We're really pleased to have you. Before we kick off, I wonder, could I just have a quick show of hands if this is your first visit to St Paul's Cathedral? Fantastic, that's quite a few of you. So it's wonderful to have you here for the first time, and we hope that you will come back and visit your cathedral again and again. We're absolutely delighted to have such a wide range of speakers here today talking about crime, punishment, and forgiveness. In a moment, I'm going to welcome your chair, but first I'm just going to run through a bit of housekeeping with you and let you know a bit about the structure of the day. Now, the speakers will be introduced before they speak, and you have handouts that were on your chairs that give you a little bit of information about everyone who's speaking today, and they have such a wide range of experience of the prison system and personal experience of forgiveness as well, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from them and learning. Housekeeping. We do not have any planned fire alarms today. If the fire alarm does go off, then we will need to leave this area the same way that we've come in. So we exit from the doors at the back and file straight through the crypt area and up the steps and outside. And the staff will be there to help direct you should that happen. We're due to be finishing the conference today at 2:45. Should anybody desperately need to use the bathroom before then please just quietly sneak out. And again, somebody will be on hand at the back to help show you where to go. So, our chair for this afternoon is the Rt Revd Graham Tomlin. Now, he's come to us this morning from St Mellitus College, where he's been teaching first years about the doctrine of Scripture. He's a theologian and an author and a Bristol City fan. He's absolutely passionate that as a society we need a new vision for prisons. They shouldn't just be places where we put people and forget about them, or places that are solely focused on punishment. Rather, they should be for rehabilitation and restoration. They should be places where people are given the skills to help them reintegrate back into society, places where they can be transformed, and most importantly, places where they can be given hope. So it's my pleasure to welcome Bishop Graham here today for the start of this GCSE conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Donna, very much indeed, and welcome to all of you. It's a great delight to be here with you, and I'm really looking forward to this event. It looks absolutely fascinating to think about these issues together. So especially welcome to those of you for whom it's your first time here in St Paul's Cathedral. The themes of what we're looking at today, crime, punishment, and forgiveness, the themes that lie right at the heart of our society when you think about it. We have laws. We have laws that we are all meant to obey. And they kind of keep our society together. But of course, people occasionally break those laws. And then there's a question for us as a society is, what do we do with people who break the laws that we agree on as a society? How do we deal with, how do we respond when that happens? One of the things I do in my job is that I'm the Bishop of Kensington and one of the bishops here in the Diocese of London, so I look after a whole series of churches across West London. But one of the things I have particular responsibility for is prisons in London. So I spend as much time as I can visiting prisons across London. So I drop into Pentonville, to Wormwood Scrubs, to Feltham Young Offenders Institute, Bronzefield, which is a women's prison over in Ashford, West London. So I spend as much time as I can in those places. And whenever I go, I kind of find myself pondering this question: why do we send people to prison? We have this way of when someone breaks the law, we deprive them of their freedom and we put them in a place where they're not able to move around and do everything they want to do. And do we do that to punish them, or do we do it to treat them in some way? Do we spend Do we spend a lot of money, and it's a lot of the public purse that goes on keeping people in prison? Do we do that to protect society from people who might otherwise break the law again and damage our social life? Or do we put people in prisons to help them change, to help them discover new ways of acting and behaving and so on? It's never far away from the headlines. If you were looking at news websites today, you will see that in the Queen's speech that the government is putting forward, which is a new set of proposals that the government is looking to push through Parliament over the next few years, there are proposals for harsher sentencing for violent and sexual criminals. Is that right? Is it right that we should put extra punishment on such people? Or actually, is that just overburdening an existing a justice system which is already stretched too far? Does it actually take away hope from people that they can ever get out and live a different kind of life? But these questions are important not just within society, they're also important within religion as well. Now, we're here in St. Paul's Cathedral, this building that goes back to its very first building on this site was in around 600 AD. So there's been a church on this site for nearly 1500 years. So we also have chaplains in every prison across the country of different religions and different faiths. Christian faith, for example, and this is a Christian building, has forgiveness right at the heart of Christian faith. How does forgiveness work in our criminal justice system? So these are the kind of questions that we'll be exploring, the social, the legal, the religious aspects of the themes that we're looking at today, crime, punishment, and forgiveness. We've got a really fantastic panel of people to offer us their different perspectives, coming at this from different angles and different experiences as well. So the plan for our time together is that I'm going to introduce each speaker in turn. They're going to speak for about 10 minutes from their own perspective. And then I'm going to pick up a few of the questions that you have posed. You will know that many of you your schools have sent in questions, and I'm going to pick one or two of those. I'll pose them to each of the speakers. They'll answer those questions. And then we'll move on to the next speaker. So each one will happen in turn of our four speakers. Then we'll move into a time of wider questions and answers, questions from the floor. So if you've got a question that occurs to you as we go through, just store that up in your head. And there'll be a chance for you to ask those questions towards the end of our time. And we'll end at around 2:45, 2:50. That's the plan for the afternoon. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and it is Tim Rozier. And we're delighted to have Tim with us today. Tim is a former parole officer. He is the Youth Justice and Radicalisation Lead at the University of Derby. And so he speaks on this in an academic context as well. He's a board member of Prisons Week, and you may know that we are here today as part of Prisons Week, a week where we look particularly at prisons within our country, and particularly within the churches and other bodies beyond that. So Tim, we're delighted that you're here today. So I'll hand over to you to speak just for your time as to what you want to say to us today.
That's great. Thank you, Bishop Graham. I'm going to say hello to these folks around the side here as well. I don't want you to be out of sight and forgotten, so give us a quick wave. Good to see you as well. And during my talk, I'm going to give you one or 2 points for you to look up. And I know in your programs there's some blank pages. You might want to make some notes down of things to look up and go away and read up on after today's event. But I want to start with a story. When I was a probation officer in Derbyshire, I had a case walk through my door called Lisa. Lisa was 30 years old. She was the mother to 2 young children, and something horrific had happened in her life. She'd been caught in a destructive cycle of domestic violence, experiencing domestic violence at the hands of her partner every weekend for years, for 8-10 years. And every weekend, the same pattern of behaviour would happen. They would drink to excess, they would both become so drunk they didn't know what was happening, and it would always end in an argument and violence, and she'd get beaten up. And there was one day when everything within her just snapped. Something within her snapped. It got beyond the point of no return. And she reached for a bread knife in the kitchen, a 7-inch long bread knife, and she sunk it into the back of her partner and nearly killed him there on the spot. Thankfully, he did survive, but it caused huge internal injuries. And it was many months of touch and go. In fact, the criminal justice proceedings were held off because they weren't sure whether they were going to be looking at a murder charge or a lesser charge of serious violence. And Lisa came into my office as a probation officer, and I got given the folder to look at. And I had this young woman who her whole life had just fallen to bits. It was going to be a case of facing justice. But the question is, what is justice? What is the justice that Lisa was going to face? Nelson Mandela, former president of South Africa, said that no one truly knows a nation until one has been inside one of its jails. A nation should not be judged by how it treats its highest citizens, but those it considers its lowest. There's something about the way we approach justice and prisons which says something about us as a society. And one of the questions I think it's important to ask is, what is the purpose of prison? Is it just to punish, or is it to protect, deter, or rehabilitate? And what do we mean by all of those terms? Well, I think it's all of those things, but it does sit within a political context in this country of a thirst, an insatiable thirst for punishment and retribution. And I think, in my experience of having worked in prisons over a number of years, that actually prison does more harm and damage than good in the vast majority of cases. England and Wales is one of the most punitive nations in Europe. It sends 268 prisoners per 100,000 of population to prison, far higher than any other European nation. We just love to punish people and send them to prison. And if you want to look at some of the statistics that are quite shocking around that, one thing for you to look up is a thing called the Bromley Briefing, which is called the Prison Fact File by the Prison Reform Trust, which is a great compendium of statistics that really show you the extent to which we love prison in this country. And government after government have made points about trying to be tough on crime. Tony Blair, back in the 90s and early 2000s, was tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. And Boris Johnson, even in the last week or two, has said he wants to pay for 10,000 new prison places and see tougher prison sentences. Some politicians talk about rehabilitation, which is about making people better. But I think our current prison system actually promotes a thing that I call rehabilitative hedonism. In other words, it has at its heart a destructive individualism, where really prisoners are encouraged to do things to make amends in order to what's in it for them, special privileges in prisons or an early release, rather than actually the inherent worth of living a moral and upright life. So prison, I think, strips people of all the things that makes them human. It strips them. It makes a prison promotes a loss of identity, relationships, confidence, independence, responsibility, and trust. But as a Christian probation officer and a Christian who's worked in criminal justice, I actually believe the criminal justice system's aim should be to minimize harm and to maximize humanity. To minimize harm and maximize humanity. And I think the role of Christians and other people of faith is to rehumanize the system by challenging injustices, recognizing the whole person at all times, and seeing people through the eyes of a loving God who wants them to change. So at the complete opposite then of what prison does, I think Christians believe that there's something far more important about the justice system than just punishment. And Christians believe that this is what Jesus, who's the central figure in the Christian faith, came to do. Jesus modeled a way that led to the creation of a new identity, who builds and strongs relationships, who sees the whole person, who builds social bonds and promotes trust. There's one story that I think sums this up, and I encourage you to go away and look at it. There's a story in the New Testament of the Bible in John chapter 8, and it's a story of the woman caught in adultery. At the time, the law said that the punishment for that crime should be that she is stoned to death. That's what the law at the time said. But we read in this passage that Jesus had a different response. He doesn't condone a behavior. He doesn't just shove it under the carpet and says it doesn't matter. But actually, he doesn't condemn her to what the law required either. But he actually found a third way. He gave her a second chance by challenging her behavior, but showing her grace and compassion and telling her to change her ways. In other words, he didn't just look at her current predicament, he saw her future potential, and that was his driver to what he wanted to see. There's a great video that I'd also encourage you to look up. If you type into YouTube, Mary Johnson, The Power of Forgiveness. Mary Johnson, The Power of Forgiveness. It's a compelling story about how somebody who sees with Jesus' eyes responds differently to perhaps the way of the world. Mary Johnson's son was murdered, and but then she forgave him, and her son's killer moved in next door. There's one in closing, there's one Bible verse that's motivated me in my work throughout my criminal justice career, and that's from Micah 6, verse 8, which is in the Old Testament, and it says this: He's shown you what is good, so what does the law require of you? To act justly, love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. In other words, to act in a way that shows justice, true justice modelled by Jesus, to be merciful and gracious, and to be humble by recognising that I'm no better than anyone else. Thereby, but by the grace of God, go I. So I started with the story of Lisa. What happened to Lisa? Well, I ended up writing her pre-sentence report, and she was given a suspended sentence, far more lenient than perhaps the law required. But she had to work with a probation officer, me, for 3 years. And during that time, we talked a lot. We cried a lot together. She asked me to pray for her, and she became a Christian through chatting to her cousin, who was a Christian as well. And I saw in the space of 3 years her life radically changed. She became less angry. She actually ended up marrying the partner that she stabbed, and her life transformed, and she now runs a food bank and a charity working with poor people within her society. So had she been given the prison sentence that the law required, where would Lisa have been today? Would she have changed completely? Well, I think not. On that day, I think the judge showed compassion and saw her future potential. By doing that, her relationships were restored, transformation was realised, and in my view, I think true justice was done. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. So, Tim, if I can take just a couple of the questions that have been posed by different groups around the room beforehand, and if I can just give them to you. I guess the first one is from St Mary and St John Church of England School, and the question is, in your opinion, what part of the criminal justice system needs the most reform and why?
I've worked in criminal justice one way or another for about the last 20 years or so, just over 20 years, and I think there's not one specific part that needs change. I think actually there's one major thing that if we changed, everything else would fall into place, and that is the penal policy, the social policy that drives the whole criminal justice system. And it affects the police, the courts, the probation and prison services, and all the other services. And as I said in my talk just now, I think the UK has this insatiable thirst, this obsession with retribution as punishment. When they talk about justice, actually what the UK talks about is retribution. And I gave some statistics around that. And you've seen the politicians, whatever colour of party they are, try to be tough on crime. And I think one of those things is to be seen to be soft on crime is political suicide. And so we kind of keep going around in circles. But actually, the evidence says something entirely different. If you look at the Norway model, if you were to research Norway criminal justice system, they hardly lock anyone up in prison, but they invest all of their resources in community-based sentences and rehabilitative care and see the person and help them to change. So I think actually the whole social policy, the penal policy landscape needs to change, and with it, the right funding to change the system needs to go with it. With a lack of funding, an obsession with locking people up, we just keep repeating the same mistakes. And then the crime rate goes up, the prison population goes up, and more harm is done. So if I had my way, I'd go right to the heart of government and change penal policy.
Thank you. Okay, and to go to another question, just maybe a different angle on a similar theme. This is a question from May at the Greycoat Hospital. How can criminals be justly sentenced when it's so difficult to assess psychological damage in previous years that might have contributed? So many people who end up in prison who had really difficult upbringings. So how is it fair to, if you like, sentence people when people have had that kind of psychological damage in childhood or in adolescence or whatever it might be?
There's no doubt about it. It's really, really challenging. And I can't hand on heart say that the system is completely unbiased. Of course not. It's made up of human beings doing their job to the best of their ability. But like all of us, we have our own biases and filters through which we see the world. And I've been in court when I've seen travesties of justice take place, and it's really uncomfortable to witness when you think, actually, that was the wrong decision based on what you know about somebody. But actually, the system has got a number of checks and balances in place to try and remove bias. So in sentencing an offender, the court considers a whole range of different perspectives. They don't just look at the charge sheet or what the police say has happened. They take a holistic view of the person. And there's a number of professionals that the court will listen to. So I mentioned that I was a probation officer, and in the course of my career, I wrote in the region of 1,400 pre-sentence reports on people, which was looked at the socio-economic and emotional background of the offender, and the judge would consider that report when sentencing as well. But May talks about the psychological impact, and actually one of the big things is that psychiatrists or mental health practitioners also undertake assessments when looking at the offender in the courts, and based on their expertise, often with a second opinion, they present a report to the court which the judge will take into consideration as well. But I think the psychological impact is not the only thing that needs to be considered. There's all sorts of things that happen to individuals in their lives, whether it's growing up in a fatherless home, whether it's drug use, childhood trauma, a head injury, whatever it is. There's all sorts of things that impact on the life of an offender, some of which the court may or may not know about. So I think it's important to take into account the fact that the court does take into account the roles of experts, the views of experts. But one of the good things about the UK system is it is an adversarial system, which means that there are barristers or lawyers who advocate on behalf of the different sides within court. And actually, by having that robust discussion for the prosecution and defence, they hold each other to account and get to the bottom of some of the issues. And so actually, I think the adversarial system does weed out some of the bias and try to get to the facts at the heart. And I think finally, judges are also very, very well trained. Despite what the media portrays them to be, there is a stereotype of a Crown Court judge, but in my experience, these are incredibly discerning, talented lawyers with many years' experience who've then gone through extra training and ultimately have compassion at their heart. So I think they're very gifted people, taking into account a lot of information, and while bias can't be ruled out completely, I think actually there are checks and balances in place to try and find a clear answer.
Thank you. And Tim, just one last question, which is from St Magdalene Academy, the question is, what is being done to reduce corruption in prisons? And maybe if I can add a little spin on that one as well. You've been talking about a radical change to our penal system in this country. Do you think prisons are redeemable? Or should we do away with them altogether and replace them with something else? So what is being done to reduce corruption, and actually should we be thinking of an entirely different system?
Yes. I mean, in terms of a different system, I think there are two types of people who will comment on, or campaign about prisons. There are those that are prison abolitionists who want to do away with prisons altogether, and there are prison reformers who want to see them change. My own personal view is I'm a prison reformer. I don't think doing away with prison completely is necessarily a good idea. I think the prison does have a place in terms of public protection and in some cases deterrence. But I think we overuse it, as I said in my talk. So I don't think we'd do away with prisons, but I think we need to scale it back and reimagine the focus. And in terms of corruption, that's one of the real big challenging situations at the moment. I've done some work in prisons all over the country. One such prison is HMP Oakwood in the West Midlands, a huge prison, takes about 2,100 prisoners, and they've had a big issue with drones. Where staff and also friends of family fly drones over the prison and drop off mobile phones and drugs to the window of their cells and deliver them. And so there's all sorts of things being done about corruption. So they put netting up to stop drones. They put blocking systems so drones can't fly by. So technologically, there's stuff like that happening. But actually, one of the biggest issues is around the corruption of staff. It is a very small minority, but they have a big impact. And recently, Boris Johnson, the new government, have talked about a new system where they're trying to address this. And over the last 5 years, 2,500 prison staff were caught and disciplined for corruption. That might be having relationships with prisoners, that might be bringing in drugs and so on. And so the government has set up this new specialist task force called the Counter-Corruption Unit. It's going to be like a specialist police unit to manage the intelligence, and they will pursue corrupt staff and bring them to justice. So there's a renewed effort around that sort of corruption, but the reality is you're never ever going to weed it out entirely. And so therefore, I think one of the things you need to do is completely reimagine the system, let alone just fight the fires of corruption.
Tim, thank you very much for both your presentation, raised some really interesting questions for us, and also your answers to the questions too. So that's been a great start to considering the issues that we're looking at. And Tim's approached that from the perspective of a probation, as a parole officer, I think working with people who are at different stages in the criminal justice system. We're moving now on to Mary Foley. Mary, it's wonderful to have you with us today as well. And as you will have read in the little booklet, Mary's daughter Charlotte was murdered aged 15 back in 2005. And so she comes to this with a different story and experience of the topics we're thinking about today. She got involved since then in the Forgiveness Project, which is an organisation that uses stories of people who've been affected by crime in all kinds of ways. And she's a storyteller for that project. So Mary, we're delighted you're here today. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
So I'll hand over to you.
Hello everybody. As my colleagues just said, my name is Mary and I have a story that happened to my daughter Charlotte back in 2006. Charlotte was 15 years old. She was getting ready to sit her exams, her GCSE exams, and she was a happy-go-lucky girl. She wasn't the type of girl to hang around on the road. She wasn't in a gang. She was very friendly, very loving. She was the type of girl, if she met you and she heard nasty things about you, she wouldn't take it on board. She'd get to know you for herself. So she'd embrace everybody. That's the way Charlotte was. She had her challenges in school like you guys do, I suppose, with teachers and, you know, your schoolmates and stuff. So she was very much normal. Charlotte befriended a young girl called Marisha, and Marisha was 17 years old. Charlotte was 15, as I just said. And Marisha, she wasn't at school. She was hanging around on the road. She was more, I would say, road, streetwise type of girl. Charlotte only knew her for 3 months. She did say to Charlotte, "You're my cousin," on my dad's side, but that was not true. So Charlotte continued just to be friends with her. And Marisha had an ongoing feud with another girl called Beatrice. And Marisha was the bully type. She would go into our local Stratford Centre and she would happen to bump into Beatrice and basically just bully Beatrice for the sake of bullying Beatrice. And on one occasion, Charlotte happened to be with Marisha, and Marisha decided that she's going to bully Beatrice, try and take off her phone. And Charlotte was with Marisha and 3 other of Marisha's friends. And from that day, there was contention between Marisha and Beatrice. So what happened? They got hold of each other's telephone numbers and they decided they're going to have it out with each other at this particular 16th birthday party that was going to be held in Ilford. On the way there, Marisha and Beatrice, they were goading each other on the phone. Beatrice is on the phone, on the bus, saying, "Come to this party, I'm going to stab you, I'm going to shank you, all these threatening things, to the point where the bus driver could hear what was going on, what this young girl was saying to this other young girl on the phone. So Charlotte stayed around her dad's that weekend, and she decided with her dad, without my knowledge, that she was going to go to this 16th birthday party. So as far as I know, I was at home. Charlotte was spending the weekend with her dad, and she had her eyebrows done that day. She went to get some clothing. She went back to her dad's, and she left her dad's around 8 p.m. that evening and phoned her dad and said, "I'm on the bus, I'm on the way to the party." I had no idea that Charlotte was going to be going to this party. So she arrives at this party. As far as I know, from what witnesses were saying, it was a normal 16th birthday party. Everyone was having great fun. Beatrice was on her way to the party. Charlotte knew nothing of the conversation that happened between Beatrice and Marisha. She knew nothing of it, so she's at that party. Marisha phones one of her friends to say she's not going to be coming to the party now because she's sick and her mum's not going to let her go. So Marisha stays at home, even though she'd planned with Beatrice that they were going to have it out at this party. She never turned up. Charlotte went, and from what the witnesses says, there was a conversation between Charlotte and Beatrice on the dance floor. Charlotte went upstairs into this young girl's bedroom, whose 16th birthday party it was. There was a group of girls in there just freshening up, doing their makeup or their hair. And Charlotte's come out of the bedroom to go into the toilet. And Beatrice is coming up the stairs. And she's met Charlotte on the landing. And she said to Charlotte, "What did you say to me downstairs?" Because if you can imagine, people are talking, music's blaring. And with that, Charlotte had her hands out and said, "What do you mean?" And Beatrice stabbed her once in the chest. And Charlotte collapsed back into the bedroom. And if you can imagine the mayhem that was going on. When Beatrice had stabbed Charlotte, she had severed a major heart valve. So every time Charlotte's heart was beating, blood was profusely coming out. So the girls were screaming. Beatrice, at that time, she ran down the stairs. Her cousin stopped her and said, "What have you done?" And Beatrice turned around and said, "Get out of my way. Do you want me to shank you?" Which was a slang word. I think some of you guys may know it. She moved out the way. Beatrice run out the house. And by those few seconds or minutes, everyone knew what happened. And a group of lads chased Beatrice out of the house. Fortunate for Beatrice, there was a police car around the corner. Beatrice ran to the police officer. The police officer put Beatrice into the car because if you can imagine, 5 burly, strapping young lads chasing this one girl. So Beatrice is in the car. Then the young lads got to the police officer and said, "She's just stabbed somebody." And at that time, all the people at the party were phoning ambulances and police. And if you can imagine the jam that was going on, and people, probably the police officers thinking, is this a joke? Is this a hoax that was going on? So it took some time for the ambulance to arrive at the party. I was at home. I had no idea that this had happened to Charlotte or she had gone to a birthday party. So I get a call at 1:30 in the morning, Sunday morning, this hysterical girl saying Charlotte has been stabbed, and the rest was like a bubble. I got to the hospital. I saw these young people crying and sobbing, and 3 doctors came into the cubicle where I was sitting and said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Foley, your daughter's passed away." And I could not believe it. I was in total shock, and so was my community, her school. It was devastating for everybody. We went to court, and I went to court. It was held in the Old Bailey. Beatrice, at that time, she got 15 years for murder. During the time she was, going back a few steps, during the time before she was sentenced, she was on remand, and my pastor in my church wrote to Beatrice, because that's the type of man he is. He is a true Christian. So he wrote to her, and she wanted to write to me, and she wrote to me, and she said she was sorry for what she had done. She wasn't going after Charlotte, she was going after Marisha, and it's a wicked thing she's done. And we was in communication for a few months, and the communication stopped after a while. But I myself, I was very much challenged being a born-again Christian. And when you are in a relationship with God, it's not just reading the Bible or quoting the Bible, because that's when the rubber hits the road, when stuff happens in your life and Jesus says, you must forgive. And he didn't say forgive this particular offence, but don't forgive that one. So I knew that I was being challenged by what I've read over the years and the relationship and the reality of Jesus in my life. And it took some time, but I had decided it's a decision that I had to make. And I said, God, I forgive her. And it was only by the grace of God that I was able to do that. And because of my relationship with God, I see Jesus, he's not just on a cross. yes, he died 2,000 and odd years ago, but he's so much as real as me and you today. So it's the reality of Jesus in my life that I was able to forgive Beatrice. And since then, I've done many talks. I've been to prisons. I've sat with prisoners, and a lot of their lives are very much dysfunctional, as much as Beatrice's was. Her dad had said to her, if anyone hits you, you hit them back twice as hard. She often saw her dad pick up a knife and use it on her mum. So domestic violence for Beatrice was a norm. For her to actually pick up a knife, she did not only come with one knife to the party, she came with three to that party. So she was brought up in a background which was really dysfunctional. And that's what I saw when I went to the Old Bailey. I saw somebody who was a product of where they were living and the family environment. She never chose to be like that, and I'm sure her mother didn't say, well, I'm going to give birth and I'd like you to become a murderer. I'm sure Beatrice did not want to kill anybody that night, but no excuses for her. She felt threatened by Marisha every time she came into the area. And we heard in court on one occasion, Marisha did threaten her with a knife, and she got away from Marisha. So there's a lot of background to why as Beatrice did that to my daughter. But as I said, it's the grace of God. I give him all the glory that I was able to forgive Beatrice and to move on.
Mary, thank you. That is a remarkable story, and I think just the silence as we listened to that was testament for how powerful a story it is. If I can just ask a couple of questions that have been posed by people here in the room. One is a question from Isaac at the Urswick School. Do you think, from your experience, the family of the victim should have any say in the treatment of the perpetrator? Should the family be involved in sentencing, in deciding in some way how someone like Beatrice should be treated?
I'm not quite sure whether or not they should be involved, because I think there's a lot of emotion, high voltage emotion going on there, because the family's deeply hurt and wounded because of what's happened. But I think they should be involved as in what is happening, and I agree with you both about rehabilitation, of that word, sorry. Finding out about that person, why would they commit that offence, what has happened in their life. I more go down that line rather than stick them in prison and let them do so many courses that really is not helping them to look at their life, really, and find out, why did I do that? Why have I got anger? Why have I got resentment? So, but yeah.
Thank you. And another one from Wyvern and St Edmund's School. It's a tricky one, this one. Is there any point at which it's morally wrong to forgive? Is there ever a point where something is so bad, so terrible, it's not the right thing to forgive? Is it always right to forgive?
I think it is right to forgive, because it not only helps the perpetrator, them thinking, oh my gosh, they've forgiven me, it also helps you as a person. And when I look at my faith, Jesus came to this earth sinless, without sin, and he did no wrong, but yet he forgave us for all of our sins, and he died on the cross for all of our sins. So I see it as, how could I withhold forgiveness for somebody else? I think you mentioned that story about the woman caught in adultery. Not only did Jesus forgive her, but he said to those who surrounded her, you who's without sin, cast the first stone. So I think, we're all able as human beings to do really bad things to one another. We're all able to do that. But for some reason we don't. We choose not to do that. So yeah, I think forgiveness is power, definitely power, because if you don't, the person who's offended you, they have the strings to your emotion. They're the one who dictates how you're going to live. You're going to live in anger, you're going to live in resentment, you're going to live in bitterness. They're dictating to you. But when you forgive and you release that person, it's not being soft. You're saying you are the stronger person and I'm not going to allow you to dictate my life any further. So forgiveness is more about you as a person, not about the perpetrator.
Thank you, Mary. And just one last question. It's a question from Yasmin at Haggerston School. Is the process of restorative justice used frequently enough in the UK? I guess you've been talking about, in some ways, the involvement of families and victims of crime in the ongoing, maybe not in the sentencing, but in kind of establishing a relationship. Have you seen that happen in the criminal justice system?
Not as much.
As it might be?
Not as much as I think it should be. I think we should really go full blow on this, on restorative justice, because when I used to tell my stories in prisons, sitting with hardcore prisoners who've committed murder and other really bad crimes, and I tell my story and I tell them that I've forgiven, they break down in tears. They break down in tears and they talk about their life. They're not condoning what they've done, but it helps them reflect about their life, growing up as a young person, growing up as an adult. And that's what it does. It tends to restore them. And on many occasions, as I've spoke, the prisoners want to meet the victims and make amends with them. Forgiveness may not be the word that they use, but they want to make amends. So restorative justice, we need that so much more.
Thank you, Mary, very much for sharing your story and again for your answer to the questions as well. We're going to move on to our third speaker now, and again we're delighted to have Rahena Begum with us today. Rahena, welcome, and thank you again for giving your time. Rahena is a youth offending service officer in Southwark. She's been working and volunteering in schools and youth centres across London. She has been working for the Southwark Youth Offending Services for quite some time. Now she established the first Asian youth project in Southwark and speaks from her own Muslim faith, and it's great to have you here with us, Rahena, to offer your perspective on some of the issues we're talking about today. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. First of all, I'd like to start off with the Islamic greeting, salam, which means peace. So salam to everybody. And you guys are there as well. We haven't forgotten you. I've come here today not as an expert on Islam, nor as an expert in law, but my foundation and my belief and the work that I do as a profession has brought me here today to share some stories, but mostly learn from you guys as well, because I know there's loads of interesting questions that you have put forward. Now, I've written loads of stuff and I can't see because I'm so nervous. I'm jet lagged because I just arrived from America yesterday because I had to go on a family emergency. So I'm really grateful that I'm here, and it's really humbling to be sitting in front of you, all of you, and to share what I have to say. Like I said, I work in the youth offending services in Southwark, and I started my work about 30 years ago. Please don't try and work out how old I am, because I'm not going to tell you. But my work is really, my experience with young people and my experience, life journey has brought me where I am today. My belief in Islam is fundamental to who I am and what I am and the delivery of what I do. A lot of the subject today, the crime, punishment and forgiveness, a lot of it has been discussed already, and a lot of the things that have been said that I would have liked to say as well. But what I like to do is look at forgiveness. Now, like I said, Islam, like how I started with the word peace, Islam is a religion of peace, and often it's not seen as that. We have people who are very radicalized. We have people who are very prejudiced and biased and see Islam in a form that it really isn't. But a true believer and a true person who sees different religions, they will see that any religion is peace. And forgiveness is also part of every religion. It doesn't matter whether you're a Jewish or a Christian or a Muslim. It is a fundamental part of your belief system is to forgive. Saying that, it's not always easy. As people as humans, we go through life experiences, whether it's someone close to you or someone you don't know, whether they've harmed you directly or indirectly and caused you some kind of grief. Sometimes it's very hard to forgive. But I believe, from my perspective, forgiving makes you a better person, because forgiving, if you hold on to something, you build up a lot of resentment, as Mary has said. Also hatred in your own way, in a sense you don't understand why that person has done whatever to you, or say, well, why did they do that? So you kind of start building resentment, hatred in yourself towards someone else that might have harmed you in return. You know, you're feeling really not yourself and thinking, okay, what is it that I've done, or what is it I can do to get that revenge back? And revenge is not good either. There are loads of questions in front of me, but what I'd like to do is talk about some things that, in terms of talking about forgiveness and talking about my life experiences. As a Muslim woman growing up in Britain, I was born in Bangladesh and came here at a really early age. So my education system here, I've been educated through here. When I came here, I didn't know a word of English, so went through my secondary school with very little English, did my GCSEs, didn't get very good results because English as a second language, had loads of teachers who are very, thinking back then, and the system back then was very different. Yes, we do have institutional racism, we still do, but things then, as me growing up and my family growing up in Britain, being the only Asian girl in the whole school, believe it or not, at that time, was very difficult. Prejudicism, biasism from all sectors, whether you're a young person, whether it was a principal, whether it was another member of staff. It was very, I didn't quite understand it then. I really didn't quite understand why this was going on, partly because I didn't think it was happening. But as I grew up and I started learning things, I realized it is the word racism, it is the word bias, it is the word prejudicism that held me back quite a lot. But I went through that. I did my GCSEs, went back and did my GCSEs when I was at college. So I went back and did them because, as I said, I didn't pass my GCSEs because of my language. But also saying that, I'm personally, saying all that, I mean, without getting into too much details, I mean, I had, my family were, from Bangladesh. My parents were from Bangladesh who didn't know a word of English, who came here, worked really hard to be where we are today. I'm also severely dyslexic, but I went through my whole school years, my whole education system, to be only 10 years ago through my work, my profession, that I got assessed, and it was that, yes, I'm dyslexic, hence reading and writing was very difficult for me, but teachers felt that I was being awkward, not answering the questions. I was being difficult because I didn't understand what they were saying. So it was very difficult. But I am here where I am today, and what I like to say to all of you is that don't let anything or anybody hold you back. There might be sometimes things that you might not understand, because I didn't know what dyslexia was. I didn't know why I couldn't read and write English or Bengali or Arabic, because it took longer than most people would. So, there are times in ourselves that we might not understand why we're not achieving or why we're not doing what we're doing, but at the end of the day, you can achieve. So, for me, in terms of forgiveness, it is about thinking back, and it's about thinking back to people who treated me really bad, thinking back, okay, what is it that I do? And yes, at that time, I did hold a lot of resentment. I held a lot of hatred because I didn't quite understand why this was happening to me, why they were treating me like that. But I let a lot of it go. I didn't say it was easy. I'm not going to say it's easy, but I let a lot of it go. And it made me a better person to be where I am today. I work with a lot of young people from all different cultures, all different backgrounds, who believe in a lot of different things. Doesn't mean they have to be religious, doesn't mean they have to be, coming back from a strong belief system. It is about being a human first. I mean, one of the examples is that, I've talked about my schooling, I've talked about my education to be where I am today. And one of the questions that was put forward to me that I would kind of cover here as well is about Islamophobia. Now, being a Bengali, British, Muslim woman, growing up in this country, it's not been easy. I have not been practicing. I mean, I'm a Muslim, born Muslim, but my practicing really started about 15 years ago when I lost my sister in an accident, and she, religious became very fundamental to me because it was a way of kind of forgiving what was going on there, what happened at the time, but also thinking, how do I find peace in myself to be able to move me forward? Now, Islamophobia, as I said, it is still going on. It does happen, but what is society doing? What are we individually doing about it? Now, a lot of people will say, well, Islam, it is about terrorism. It is about, people going and killing each other, or the punishment system in the Sharia law is totally different to the English law. But if you really look at it, and if you look at the true religion, Islam, it is about peace, and it's about understanding people, it's about tolerance, it's about understanding tolerance, and it's about forgiveness. Yes, there are extremism in every religion. It doesn't matter whether you're a Muslim, like I said, or a Jew or a Christian. These extreme beliefs. Now, what do you do with those beliefs is different. But in terms of Islam and in terms of our Prophet and the peace be upon him, the teaching of Quran, the guidance of the Quran, if you really look at it, and I'm not saying that you'll go back and read the Quran and read the whole story of Islam and become Islamic. I don't mean that, but I do mean what I mean in terms of you studying in GCSEs and studying Islam, is that look up a few things and get equipped, get educated in the sense that, don't believe everything in the newspaper. Don't believe everything that someone sitting next to you who doesn't like somebody and says, oh, this person is that because their religion. It's not about that. Learn for yourself, make your own decisions, because, for example, years and years back, I wouldn't be sitting here chatting to you all or talking to you all, because I would be seen as a different person. I would be seen as a person who shouldn't be here because this is not my place. But what society has moved on, equality, diversity in this country, it is very good. I know we all might say, well, this is not so, this country might be that we don't want to be here, but it's what we make it, it's what we make society, and you are the generation that will make it and break it, and also put forward positive things in the future. And you are the learners, but also the leaders, and believe in that, because racism, equality, and discrimination will exist. It doesn't matter how old you are, or where you are, or who you are. That will be it. But it's fundamentally is what you believe and how you, want to make a difference. Just touching on Islamic law, yes, it is very different. But also, what I believe that in this country, the system, the justice system, yes, it is very difficult. It is very punitive, but it is one of the best systems we have. If you follow a lot of countries, there are other countries who are doing very, very much better, and there are other countries who are not doing so good. But this country, I do believe, the system does work to an extent, but it's also a fair system to a sense that it does look at punishment, it does look at rehabilitation, it also looks at victim. And it's not about just locking people up. It's not about, forgetting and throwing away the keys. It's also about giving people chances. It's not perfect, but I do believe it works, and it can work, and it can be improved. I'm kind of losing track and going off a little bit, but I'm sure Chair will bring me back and give me questions that I could answer. Thank you for listening, by the way.
Thank you.
Totally jet lagged.
So just a couple of questions to pick up from you. One, you work with young offenders, and that's a lot of your work you do with the Youth Offending Service and so on. And there's a question here from Wyvern St Edmunds School. How much do you think parents should take responsibility or even blame for the crimes committed by their children or teenagers who are still part of their own household?
I did see that question, and I thought this is really, the questions that everybody have put forward is really, really interesting, and I'm not patronising, I really mean it, and it was really, really well thought out. A lot of the questions that, not just to me, but to the panels, and it is really, really good questions, so well done on that. In terms of parents, in terms of the youth offending team, okay, so do we blame my parents for what I do? So if I've done something wrong, do I blame my parent? Maybe, depending on what it is, I'll want them to take the blame. But on a serious note, is to what extent, okay, I'll go and nick a sweet from the shop. It's wrong for me to do, but I've done it, okay? So do I blame my parent for that? Maybe not, because it's part of growing up. Please don't go and do that and say, Rahena said I can nick a sweet. It's not about that. I'm just trying to give you an example and put it into perspective. So that's one. Then I go and commit a serious crime, like maybe stab somebody. Now, do I blame my parents for that, or is it me? What is it that happened on that day? What led me to do that? Now, yes, there are a lot of young people that I work with that are from broken families, single parent, whether they're living with their mother or their father, because we tend to forget about fathers. There's a lot of fathers bringing up children by themselves. So we've got broken homes, we've got single parents who are trying to bring up children. Very challenging nowadays. Growing up in society now at your age is the most challenging things that are happening to young people. Yes, we went through different stages and different discriminations and whatever when we were growing up, but this day and age it is very difficult. So a parent is doing their utmost best to bring up this child. Now, there are parents that we could turn around and say, yes, you are to blame because, one, you're not letting your child go to education, not really caring for them and not really bothered about the fact that they should go into education. You let your child out all night, don't know where they are, don't know what they're doing. You're letting them hang around with people that are no good, meaning that they might be involved in antisocial behavior, crime. So in that sense, maybe, right? But really, truly, do we blame our parents or do we take that responsibility? We have parenting orders like, we talked about pre-sentencing report. When a young person does a crime, goes to court, and the court is asking us to do a report on that young person. Now, there are things like parenting orders where we feel that parents should take that responsibility for that young person or for the crime they committed to be able to kind of support them away from crime. We also work with parents on a level where, they are saying, look, I don't know what to do with my child. They're totally out of control. They're behaving in such a way, I can't control them. I can't do this with them. They're not listening. They're not doing education. Now, also the fact that in this country, the law is that you must go to education. If a child doesn't go to education, parent will be given a fine or taken to prison. So it's a form of, yes, parents are taking responsibility. But you ask yourself that as a young person, right, to what extent would you want your parents to take blame for what you have done?
Rahena, thank you very much indeed, both for your story and the work you do, and for your very perceptive answers to the question too. Thank you, Rahena, very much indeed. So our final speaker is Jonathan Aitken. Jonathan was an MP, Member of Parliament. He was a Cabinet Minister and then was convicted for telling a lie under oath in court and went to prison. So he's the only member of our panel who's actually experienced the prison service from the inside, as it were. And since then, that was a very transformative experience, has come out and was recently ordained and is now a prison chaplain in Pentonville Prison up in North London. So Jonathan, it's great to have you with us. So hand over to you to contribute this afternoon.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am a prison chaplain, which means that these three themes of your conference, crime, punishment, and forgiveness, is something in my day job I have to think about and pray about just about every day. And I see the consequences of these things and the possible answers to some of these themes every day in prison life. Last week I was in Winchester Prison, which is known all around the country now as a very tough nick, as they say. That's because there's been a television program on Channel 4, been running for about 4 weeks live from Winchester Prison. I don't know if any of you saw it, but almost everyone who did see it was horrified by the levels of violence, of drug taking, of assaults on prison officers. It was a real shattering expose, of what prison life is like. And when I was talking to the audience, somebody said, why on earth did you want to become a prison chaplain? And I answered by quoting a little verse, which I sometimes use, from a former prison chaplain a long time ago. He said, some want to live within the sound of church or chapel bell. I want to run a rescue shop within a yard of hell. And one of the things this conference has so far perhaps underestimated, that part of prison life really is pretty hellish, not just in Winchester Prison, but in many other prisons. The levels of day-to-day violence, day-to-day drug taking, lack of forgiveness, enmity, bitterness, is a real problem. I hope and pray none of you ever have to go to prison, but if you do, you will find that prisons are quite close to being hellish places, but there are a lot of good things that go in prisons also. There are often good officers, there are often good people who work on the staff, there's often quite good health care, especially for the mentally ill. There is often people who are prisoners themselves. I used to be a prisoner, and I was pleasantly surprised 20 years ago when I arrived in Belmarsh Prison, Britain's highest security prison for some reason, that the milk of human kindness flowed along the wing of Belmarsh Prison, and there were a lot of people who'd done bad things, made bad mistakes. But nevertheless, this is a sort of human scene which all types are there, and it isn't easy to generalize saying prisons are ... because there's such a mixed bag. Do prisons need reform? Enormously they do, and I hope perhaps in the questions we'll talk about some of that. What does a chaplain do? What does a chaplain need to be? I think he or she needs to be a good listener. When he listens, he then tries to think, well, how can I help as he hears whatever the prisoner is saying? Can I help practically? For example, a prisoner may be very desperate to send a message to their family. The chaplains can often help. Or maybe there's something spiritual that a prison chaplain can do. I always say as I wander down the wings and get into conversations with people, even if it's about football or something, I say at the end of the conversation, by the way, I'm in the praying business, can I pray for you? It's surprising how many of them say, oh yes, or even if it's rather reluctant, don't mind if I do, that you can, there are spiritual channels, and sometimes it's when people are in adversity on the floor that they respond best to either spiritual help or suggestions about how they might change their lives. Bishop Graham referred in his opening remarks about hope. Well, hope is a commodity in pretty short supply in our prisons, but they're not hopeless. There are people who change. There are people like probation officers or charities who really do help with the transformation. But rather key to all this is the third word in your list of topics, forgiveness. And forgiveness is in quite short supply. One of my tasks as a chaplain, I very often am asked as part of my what I call statutory duties to see those who've arrived in the prison either that day or the night before. And they're often in a state of shock. With the habitual optimism of criminals, they very often expect they will be let off by the juries or the judges will be very lenient. When they arrive in prison, they're often shocked. And they're often shocked, not in a sort of very sensible direction. A lot of them shout, I'm innocent, the jury got it all wrong. Or they are full of anger and lack of forgiveness towards the police officer who allegedly may have firmed up the verbals, or the member of the gang who left his fingerprints on the mantelpiece, and they've forgotten that they've done the crime themselves. And so the forgiveness problem, the 34th word in the Lord's Prayer is the word as. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive them that trespass against us. And very often persuading people in prison that forgiveness of the people who may have wronged you is essential if you hope to be forgiven yourself. So there are great themes in prison ministry which we can explore. And maybe we'll do that in questions. But I actually love the life of being a prison chaplain because helping with a rescue shop within a yard of hell is actually what certainly the Christian religion and other religions, Islam too, teaches that we should do. We should forget about prisons. It's a rather sort of English way. We tend to pretend that prisons don't exist. They're just sort of buildings behind walls. The great thing about this conference and the people who are addressing it, I think that we all care about prisons and we would like to see them changed and reformed. How might be the subject for some of the questions and conversation afterwards. Thank you.
So, Jonathan, just a few questions that relate particularly to your work as a prison chaplain. One is from Caitlin at the Greycoat Hospital. Has becoming a priest changed your view of the criminal justice system? I guess you were in government, you presumably had views about the criminal system back in the day. Has being a prisoner, and I guess now being a prison chaplain, has that changed the way you view the criminal justice system?
Well, I think my whole experience of prisons would inevitably change it. I knew very little about prisons until I went there as a prisoner. And I learned a terrific amount about it, and yes, changed some of my views. I didn't sort of become an overnight abolisher of prisons. I didn't sort of change so radically that I suddenly said I'm a abolitionist of prisons, something like that. But I did think much more deeply. When I was an MP, I didn't think I was ever the kind of MP who sort of said, lock them up and throw away the key, or let's have tougher sentences. I think I thought already more deeply than that. But what I did understand very well was I used to talk to my fellow prisoners is even though they did not have excuses for their crimes, they often had explanations for their crimes, like they had been in care for most of their childhood and early adult life. They'd not known who their fathers were. No one had ever said to them, I love you, well done. These kind of things most of us take for granted in family life hadn't been their way. So it's not so surprising that some of them, you can explain that they didn't have moral signposts. And I've now think, certainly as a chaplain, well, starting from this often very difficult point with difficult people, how do you give hope? How do you start to transform their lives? And that certainly is a big, big change in my own personal attitudes.
Thank you. And there's one here from Mrs. Kirks at Barnwood Park School, who says, Jonathan, my dad, Phil Kane, was your chaplain while you were in HMP Stanford Hill. And she goes on to ask, what do you perceive the role of chaplains to be in prison? What's at the heart of what chaplains are there for? Are they there to convert people to Christian faith? Are they there as sort of social workers? Is there a particular role that chaplains play that the rest of the prison officers and others don't?
Well, first of all, Mrs. Kirks, I'm so pleased to be able to say some very warm words about your father, Phil Kane. He was a chaplain at one of the prisons where I served in. He was at Stanford Hill. And I remember being very nervous when I first met him because I was told he was from a church I'd never heard of called the Countess of Huntington's Confession. And I thought, crikey, what's that? And it just reminded me that actually one of the good things about prison chaplaincy, it cuts across all denominations, cuts across faiths. I mean, we are terrific cross-denominational, interfaith practitioners. We've been talking a bit about Islam this afternoon. Pentonville, I have to say, we have a marvelous interfaith cooperation. I work personally very closely with the Muslim chaplain there. He's even allowed me to preach at the Eid festival. And so we do work together across lines of some of the normal religious denominations, and that's a very good thing. Your father, Mrs. Kirk, was an inspiration to me. Maybe he's one of the reasons that I am a prison chaplain today. His Bible teaching at a very early stage of my journey, it meant an enormous amount to me. What should a prison chaplain be? Well, we ask ourselves that every day. It's quite complicated. First of all, chaplains do have to work very hard because they have certain things called statutory duties. They are required by law to visit the prison hospital and see everybody there. They are required by law to see the new arrivals. They are required by law to go to the SEG unit, which is the bad boys unit, where people have been put into solitary confinement because they've done something very bad while in prison, like smash up cells or attack fellow prisoners. On top of that, I said earlier, I think being a good listener. I'm not the kind of prison chaplain who hopes to make great instant conversions. I think life's a bit more subtle than that. I'm very keen to bring anybody to faith, but it's a slow journey. and it takes two to tango. But I often do find prisoners who are very anxious to come to chapel, come to the mosque, explore their faith. And a chaplain, I think, is really in the business of giving hope, spiritual hope, and spiritual comfort to those in prison.
Thank you, Jonathan. Maybe just one more question for you, which is a question from Class 9D at Thomas Tallis School. Does God design people to be murderers?
Well, Bishop Graham, you're the great theologian here, but I think the answer from my point of view is firmly no. We know a lot about the character of God, and one of the things we know about him is that he hates sin. And so he obviously hates a really bad sin, like murder, enormously. So the idea that he would design people to go out and be murderers seems to me extremely improbable, to put it mildly. I think the God that we know his character about is a God of justice. So he never shrank in teachings from sometimes having to impose punishment, but it was also he was a God of mercy and a God of transformation and a God of grace. And those things are really his character and not doing a kind of haute couture job designing murderers.
Thank you, Jonathan, very much indeed for your story and your experience as prison chaplain. Another fascinating angle on what we've been thinking of today. So, in a few moments, we're going to throw open the event for questions from the floor. So if you've got a question, you may be just chewing that over in your mind and getting it ready. While you do that, I'm just going to take one or two questions that have been put in and maybe reflect on those myself for a moment. So there's one from Jessie at the Greycoat Hospital that says this: if Jesus forgave wrongdoers without punishing them, do we compromise Christian principles by punishing criminals? And I said my answer to that, two parts to an answer to that. I guess one is the idea of punishing criminals. Is that what our criminal justice system should be about? I think Tim was touching on this earlier on. Is that primarily why we send people to prison? And I think I'd want to question that and say that isn't maybe the main reason why we do this, that prison is not just about punishment, as it were. Punishment is not the primary thing we do when we find people who are offending against the laws in our nation. And I suppose the second part of the answer to that would be that there is, I think, a difference between personal forgiveness, what you do as an individual, and what we do as a state and as a nation in dealing with crime. I think Mary's story very powerfully illustrates the meaning of forgiveness, because forgiveness on the one hand opens up the possibility of reconciliation. When something's gone wrong in a relationship, even if it's a kind of minor thing, you fall out with a friend over something quite small, or whether it's a really significant thing like what happened to Charlotte, forgiveness opens just the possibility of reconciliation. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen, because it may be the other person doesn't want to be reconciled, or actually there are patterns of behavior that actually mean reconciliation is not appropriate in the longer term, but it just opens up the possibility of reconciliation. It also, I think, as Mary powerfully illustrated, lets go of the hold of that person on your own heart. That's why forgiveness is so important, because if you don't forgive, you are locked into resentment and bitterness and anger, and forgiving lets go of all of that, lets go of the control of that person on your heart. So there's that side of things, the personal effects of forgiveness. But on the other hand, it seems to me as a society, we do have to think about the consequences of certain actions. And it may be that as a result of an action which may be a pattern of behavior by a particular individual, we have to think about how we prevent reoccurrence of that behavior, how we protect society from that person if it is a pattern of recurrent behavior. And there's the element, I guess, within our criminal justice system of example and deterrence for others, that if others do the same thing, well, this is what's going to happen to them as well. So there are all kinds of reasons, it seems to me, why we as a nation can't just forgive as a state. So there's a difference, I think, that many Christian theologians in the past have made between what you do as an individual and what we do as a state. And that, I think, is part of the answer to that question. I guess another Question. Well, actually, I'll leave that question because that may come up in our open questions from the floor. So if you've got a question, can you put a hand in the air? And I think there's a microphone going around. Do we have one there? Is that right? Do we have something? Okay. Here is a microphone. And if you can keep your hand, there's a couple of questions at the back there. And if the microphone can make its way to the back. Okay, if we can maybe just be quiet for a moment and just take one of the questions at the back there. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, my name's Monica and I'm from Barnwood Park.
Hi, Monica.
Thank you. I have a question for anybody there. So do you think you should, if you went to prison for your entire life, do you think you should still go to hell for the rest of your life, for the rest of eternity?
Okay, interesting question. So if you went to prison on a life sentence, if you have a belief in heaven and hell, which I guess both Islam and Christianity does that person go to hell or automatically? And maybe this is something that maybe, well, anyone can answer. Rahena, any particular thoughts on that one?
Very interesting. I mean, in all religion, I think, we have the concept of hell and heaven. But at the end of the day, if you believe in your religion and true believer in your religion, we're not the judge. We are not the judges. Forgiveness can happen at any stage. Individually, yes, it's a journey that we all take. It's a decision that we make. But when you're looking at religion and when you're looking at forgiveness from God, Allah, whatever your belief is, at the end of the day, ultimately, it is the decision up to God whether you are forgiven or not. It's a debate because some people will say, well, yeah, if you murder somebody, why should we be forgiven for murdering that? Because, you're not here to take a life, nor give a life, and it's ultimately God who does that. I believe that everybody should be forgiven to an extent. It's difficult, it's not easy, but you know what, Allah created us, Allah will take us. There's a saying that to whom we will belong and to whom we shall return. And is that stage, on your day of judgment, it is when that will, whether you're forgiven or not. Everybody will go through a stage, without going into too much religious background and too much into it. There is a stage where different people will go through because of what you've done in life, but ultimately, you will end up being forgiven. Look it up. It is very interesting. It is a very interesting debate because if you believe in a religion and if you believe two sides of it, and there are, we as people, when something's been done to us or harm is being caused to our family or us as individual, it is very hard to forgive. And it's what stage do we as individuals forgive and what stage does God forgive as well?
Thank you, Rahena. Anybody else wants to give an answer to that one?
Yeah, I would. Well, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, if he sent his son to the earth, Jesus, to die for our sins, and God has forgiven us, then in one way, it's like, if God has done it, then why couldn't we do it? And not only that, it's down to God, whatever the perpetrators have done, whatever sin they may have committed, there's no sin that God cannot forgive. But it's down to God. He's the one at the end of the day who is sovereign, and he is the one who will allow someone to go to heaven and to go to hell. So it's not down to us as human beings to decide that. Because this person murdered 60 people, so they should definitely go to hell. That it's really out of our hands. So at the end of the day, it is God's decision because he's sovereign. That's my thoughts.
So we're saying there's a difference between human judgment and divine judgment.
Yeah.
They may be the same, but they may very often are quite different. Okay. Thank you. There's more questions back there.
Hi, my name is Manera, and my question is for Rahena and Mary. Rahena, you previously mentioned about parenting and just having a troubled child, and also Mary, you talked about your daughter Charlotte. Yeah. If you were to give advice to a parent who had a child that perhaps was in a gang or dropped out of school or just isn't doing what the parent wants them to do, what's your advice for the parent? Because there are a lot of parents that are struggling to to raise their kids, and they're trying their best and they do care, but they just can't communicate with their child. What's your advice to them? And especially to Mary, because of Charlotte and her relationship with Marisha. So if you could go back in time, would you do anything different?
As you know, those of us who are parents here, we can't be with our children 24/7. Especially when they're in school, if they go, pictures or they go shopping, we just can't be with them, and we certainly can't choose their friends. I think when we start to dictate to our children, this one can be your friend, but this one can't be your friend, and you can't do this. And there are some things obviously we have to give our children advice on, but I would say always be in conversation with your child, be interested in what they're doing, who their mates are. I never knew who Marisha was. At the end of the day, Charlotte only knew her for 3 months, and it's not even a person that I would hear Charlotte speak to on the phone. Her name only came up when the young people was coming to my house and then mentioned Marisha, and I asked, oh, who's Marisha? So that's how I knew of her. So I would say, be your child's friend and be interested in where they're going and what they're doing. But at the end of the day, they do have to make their choices. As long as you teach them the fundamentals, it should be okay. But at the end of the day, once they hit 18, that's it. They're adults, and they have to make their own way, I suppose.
Thank you, Mary. Rahena?
For me, you said troubled child, and I didn't kind of mean it in that sense. It's politically in terms of there are phrases there are phrases that we use that sometimes, you think, what does that really mean? And it's what I meant by troubled child is, we all have challenging backgrounds, we all have challenging upbringings, and I think for a parent, like I said earlier on today, at your age now, being a young person in this day and age is so difficult. It is one of the hardest things growing up now, because so many challenges are facing you. Now, as a parent, I'm not a parent, but I have extended family. I've got nieces and nephews who we all live together and bringing up, and the 5-year-old will be telling you what you should and shouldn't be doing. So that's a challenge in itself. But as a parent, for me, it would be about affection, it's about care, and it's about knowing your child and knowing your parents. There's limitations, but you know what? How often are we told don't do that, and we will go and do it? So it's not about dictating to a young person, you must and must not do that. And there are a difference between right and wrong, and I think most people do know that. And the challenge now is the fact that, yes, people find, comfort in other things like gangs. Why do young people join gangs? Why do young people commit crime? It's not because the family are, a single parent, or because they have an upbringing that's challenging, or parents are not there. I work with a lot of young people who, parents are, the political term, they have, good upbringing, they have good financial, stable relationship, they've got good housing, but yet they divert and they go into crime. So there are different reasons why young people commit crime. And as a humans, it's about love and affection. I think that's the most, foundation of a good relationship. And it's in any good relationship, it's not just mother and father. It's about family relationship and friendship relationship. And often young people also have to take responsibility in a sense that, choose your friends wisely. Friends that you have now, like growing up now, you might have 30 friends. Believe me, by the time you're 20, half of those young people will not be around because they'll be doing different things. So choose your friend wisely and choose them where they will advise you good and challenge you when you're not making the right decision. But fundamentally, I would say to a parent, it is about knowing your young person, knowing your child, and giving the love and the affection which will bring them into kind of understanding and caring in return.
Thank you, Rahena. Other questions? We got one just down the front. One back there. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Okay. I'm safe, and my school is St Mary's and St John's, Church of England School.
Great.
And my question is, there's always a feel for retribution, but if someone were to have like psychological and mental issues, and they were to commit a crime, would there be like a reason or a need for prison, or should there be like another way?
Okay, so how do we handle the background of sort of mental or psychological issues in sentencing prisoners? Tim, any thoughts on this one? Or
Yeah, it depends. It's not a simple science, but there are thresholds. So if an offender comes to the attention of the courts and it's recognised that there are mental health issues or illnesses, or perhaps at the extreme end, psychiatric illness, it's clear, isn't it, that prison is not the best place to be dealing with that kind of illness. And so the law does make provisions for people like that, and rather than having a criminal justice response, a healthcare response is the most appropriate. And so given that, depending on the thresholds, psychiatric assessment and so on, it may be that an individual is given what's known as a hospital order, and rather than it going to prison, they are looked after within an institution, a facility that manages the effects of their psychiatric illness. And so rather than it being about punishment and rehabilitation, actually the focus is on treatment and care, and it's a much more of a clinical rather than a criminal justice response. So while a crime may well have been committed and there will be consequences to that, part of the role of the state is also to protect the vulnerability of the offenders themselves. And so actually there's a human recognition that sometimes the best place for the offenders is in care and off the streets in that way. So yeah, so hospital orders, and I forget what section it is, but it's of the Mental Health Act.
Thank you, Tim. Jonathan?
This is a really good question because it goes to the heart of some prison problems. When I go out on the wings at Pentonville, especially when I go on the healthcare wings, I'm constantly astonished by the number of people who appear, to a layman at least, to have pretty serious mental health problems. Sometimes that surfaces in very dramatic ways. At least I would just bet if I was to go tomorrow morning round Pentonville, I would find 20 men whose arms are all bandaged up because they have tried self-harming during the night. And people who are self-harming, cutting themselves, clearly they have some form of mental health problem. And should they be in prison at all? The answer is probably not. And we're not very good as a society at really trying to separate people who are criminals because they are bad or people who are criminals because they are in bad mental health. There are some rays of hope here. Some communities, and they vary all over the country, Stoke-on-Trent happens to be very good, Glasgow happens to be very good, Liverpool happens to be very good. They have courts which make some sort of assessment at a very early stage as to whether some of the police is arrested does or does not have a mental health problem, and intervenes to send them off not to a prison but to some form of mental health hospital care. But those local authorities or districts are exceptions, and I'm afraid the problem is big and getting bigger, and we don't have an answer to it yet, except the more early interventions we can get of those who are mentally ill, the more we will avoid some of the horrors that I see pretty regularly in prison of mentally ill patients, now prisoners.
Great, thank you for your question. Okay, we've got a few more, and it's a hand just at the front here. Oh, there's one over here as well. Yeah, good. Done right.
Hey, I'm Isaac. So my question is, we've been talking a lot about prison reform, and how can we work towards something like that with a government that is so strongly pushing for, harsher sentences? And
Okay, so the question is, how do we get prison reform when the kind of tide of government seems to be more towards severer sentences and locking people up and so on? So, yeah, Jonathan, do you want to have a go at that one to begin with?
Well, prison reform has many voices in this country. There are some very good charities, very good lobbies. I could name many of them, the John Howard League, the Prison Reform Trust, and so on. So the voices of prison reform are there, but they don't always get listened to, perhaps as much as you and I might like them to be listened to. Why not? Well, as a former practicing politician, I have to remember that prisoners have no votes, and so they don't get perhaps the attention that powerful other lobbies do. As for harsher sentences, there can be strange injustices in the sentencing system. It isn't just a sort of simple black and white situation. Should we have more lenient sentencing? Should we have tougher sentences? I may be wrong, but I think what the government have proposed today is not exactly tougher sentences. It's saying that those who at the moment automatically have their sentences cut. It's not very generally known that any prisoner at the moment, with one or two rather dramatic exceptions like terrorists and sex offenders, but every prisoner, whatever sentence they get, and you hear in the newspapers and the media, he got a 10-year sentence. Actually, all sentences are cut by half, so that really means a 5-year sentence. Now, starting from then, I think what the new Home Secretary is saying is that there are some prisoners who should not have that automatic cut. Now, that's not quite the same as having tougher sentences. It's maybe redressing a strand of public opinion which says, is it really right to say to somebody who's a multiple rapist or something that they should have their sentence automatically cut in half? And so there is a debate about this to be had once the nation moves off into any other subject other than Brexit. I think we might perhaps have some good debates about criminal justice reform. I'm a reformer, I'm a dove, not a hawk, but I think there are thoughtful arguments on both sides of the sentencing issues.
Thank you, Jonathan. Anyone else want to? Tim, any thoughts on this one? Or? No. Fine. Don't have to. That's all right. Okay. We've got a good 5 minutes or so, yes, for time for one or two quick questions as well. So there's one just here in the middle there.
Hi. It's a question specifically for Tim, but anyone could answer. Do you think that the UK has an insatiable need for retribution, or just that so many people go to prison and commit crimes because of the neglection from part of the government and the lack of education, or maybe because of a lot of people re-offend due to the failing prison system, or maybe because some people just have no other option but to commit crimes?
Okay.
Okay, do I think society has an insatiable need?
Yeah.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And let me give you an example. So it's a few years ago now, but you're all Londoners here, I think. And in 2011, there were the English riots in August of that year. And for a period of about 10 days, it all kicked off. Many of you will be quite young at the time, I'm sure by now, it shows my age. But it was really interesting to see how society responded to the English riots. And the media fueled, I think, a lot of it. And so I saw on the front pages of a lot of the newspapers and so on, kind of stereotypical images of hooded youths and really kind of emotive headlines along the lines, things like, bring these animals to justice and so on. And so actually, absolutely rightly, society was outraged by what was happening around them. But the response, I think, was actually kind of fueled by a media-driven thirst for retribution without actually understanding the reasons of what happened behind it. And as you know, the riots were sparked by racial tensions within the Tottenham area, and the situation was quite much more complex than just young people wanting free TVs and night trainers. And actually after that, there was an independent panel review that undertook some research around that, and they scratched beneath the surface and tried to find out, okay, what was the root causes as a society of what was going on. It was really quite telling, and they found a number of themes. They talked about breakdown in family, they talked about a lack of respect for authority or politicians, but ultimately it came down to one reason and one reason only, and that was poverty, a poverty of hope and a poverty of prospects. And when you start to understand how young people are thinking, you start to understand their frustration. Now, I'm not in any way condoning the behaviour, and plenty of young people who are frustrated don't go out and start fires and nick stuff. But actually we understand the context behind it. I think then when you look at that and then you look at what politicians and policymakers have to say about it, I think they often wheel out quite simplistic rationale behind some of their policies without really understanding it. And an example would be David Cameron tried to have a go. He did this thing where he was trying to say actually what young offenders need is a bit more love, try to understand the root causes. And straight away he was lambasted for the hug a hoodie concept and showed to be weak. And so the reality is, I think what happens is that politicians feel quite often that being soft on justice or being caring is seen as being weak and a vote loser. And so actually you then have this situation where the media and I think the politicians are kind of in this vicious cycle, and they don't actually look at the evidence base behind it very often. So I think there is an insatiable need. I think it's fueled by frustrations. I think it's fueled by media. But actually the evidence is quite... it says something quite different, but it's often not fashionable to look behind that. I'm saying a lot about politicians. I realise I'm not one. I don't know whether Jonathan's got anything to say and be able to speak for himself.
Thank you. Probably got time for just one more question. There's one just down the front here. Is that all right? Just part way back here. Is that all right? Okay. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mia and I go to Thomas Tallis, and my question's for Mary. I was just asking, how did you cope with your daughter's death, and what helped you apart from God and Jesus to your path to forgiveness?
I think it was because I did go to church, so I had a community of people there that loved Charlotte and supported my family so much. My neighbours, the shop where Charlotte used to go and buy her sweets every morning, the shopkeeper. So there was a lot of people around me. My husband, who was a rock, Charlotte's little brother. So it was a collective group of people that helped me so much. And God does, He uses people. So it was people in my church and my family that helped me go through, because they were mourning as much as I was for Charlotte. So yeah, it was great support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, very much indeed. So just, we're coming towards the end of our time together, and I just wanted to gather some thoughts reflecting on what we've been thinking about this afternoon. I mean, can I first of all say what fantastic questions you gave? There were a whole host of things that we didn't get around to talking about, but the questions were really very, very high quality. So thank you so much for the time you put into thinking about those, engaging with this topic in a really, really intelligent and creative way. Just 4 words I think have leapt out to me as we've gone through this afternoon and has stuck in my mind. The first word is, I think a word Tim had used earlier on, potential. The potential of each person. And I suspect that's something we probably don't see very often. Maybe within the prison system we kind of tend to think, sometimes the media encourages us to divide people between good people and bad people. There are good people and there are bad people. The bad people, we lock them all up, and the good people, we're all out in freedom and everything else. And I think one of the things that religious faith, particularly Christian faith, says about people is that there's no such thing as an irredeemably bad person. There's no such thing. There aren't just bad people. That line between good and evil, the line between good and bad, runs not between people, but within people. Each one of us is both created and loved by God, but each one of us is broken and fallen at the same time. And so, to that extent, every single human being is someone who is created by God and loved by God. That means that there's always some potential in each person, however deep they may have given themselves over to really bad patterns of behavior and so on. So I think what Tim has reminded us of in this whole arena is to keep hold of that sense of the potential of each human person. Second word, I think, is a word we've spoken of often, is forgiveness and the power of forgiveness. I think Mary was talking about forgiveness as power, that forgiveness has deep power to change people. We've heard stories today from Mary and others as well about the way in which forgiveness really has had a deep impact upon people, both those perpetrators but also the victims of crime as well. Third word that strikes me is the word relationship. I think a lot of what we've spoken about today is the importance of the relational aspect of what we do. So it's not just about a court sentencing a prisoner, putting them in prison as a kind of transaction that we do as a society. And I think each of the speakers today have spoken very powerfully about the power of relationships. Tim and his work with young offenders or offenders generally, the probation service. Mary, the power of relationship and forgiveness and the restoration of that relationship with Beatrice. Rahena, with the work she's been doing amongst young people and the importance of creating relationships in which some of those issues that lead to crime can be dealt with. And then Jonathan, with his work as prison chaplain, creating a bond, just going around the wings of a prison, creating a relationship in which change can take place. I think the last word I want to focus on is a word that's come up a couple of times in our conversation, the word hope. I think it's in the Shawshank Redemption, you may have seen that film about prison life, where towards the end of it, the kind of message of the film is given when one of the main characters says, "A hope is a great thing, maybe the best of things." There's not much you can do in life without hope. If we take away hope from people, there's almost no possibility of change. Much crime is fueled by a lack of hope. Young people feeling there isn't any prospects, nothing to really live for, nothing really to hope for, and that gets them into patterns of behavior, into relationships that are really destructive. But in prison also, if we just take away hope from people, there's no possibility of change, that actually they're endlessly in a cycle of reoffending, we are never going to get out of the situation where we are at the moment. So the importance of hope seems to be crucial. And in all of those things, the potential of people, the power of forgiveness, the importance of relationship, and the importance of hope. It seems to me that faith, religious faith that we've been talking about this afternoon, is a powerful source of those things. And so it's been good to explore some of those themes as we talked about it this afternoon. So as we come to the end of our time together, can I thank all those from St. Paul's who have hosted today. It's been really well set up. Thank you so much to you, to Donna and Caroline, for the work you've done in setting this up. Can I also say a big thank you to you for your contributions and your questions and the ways in which you've engaged with it. So well done, all of you. And then finally, a big thank you again to our 4 panelists and what they've offered to us from their different perspectives. So thank you.
So just to finish, then I just echo those thank yous to our panelists, Tim, Mary, Rahena and Jonathan, for their unique insight and for unpacking those themes that Bishop Graham summed up: potential, forgiveness, relationship and hope. And a huge thank you to him for his skillful chairing and inspiring conclusion. And a thank you to you. Those were magnificent questions, both the ones you sent in and the ones you asked today. Absolutely wonderful. So it's now time for you to go. I'm just going to ask that what you do for us after you leave, or if before you leave, if you can, is in the teachers' packs you were given some evaluation forms, one for an adult and then another set of forms for some of your students. It'd be really great if you would fill those out for us to help us know how to do these conferences again, what kinds of things can we improve on, and what kinds of conferences could we offer.
I'd love to do that.
I'm going to ask for 3 schools just to wait, because you're going to be escorted up. You've booked to climb the dome, so you're going to be brought up there and escorted up. So if Wyvern St Edmunds, Barnwood Park and Ark Academy could stay seated, you're going to be brought up to the dome entrance. And everyone else, you are free to go and wander around the cathedral. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.